The perception, well, I mean, there's an enormous amount of excitement in the anarchist community and sort of political communities in general. I think a lot of other people, the media trap is such that people don't really know what's happening. So when I came here, I didn't have that much advanced knowledge. And I'm still sort of getting a sense because I've only talked to some sorts of people, and there's so many different perspectives, different tendencies, and so I feel that I'd have to be here a year before I really even began to understand the full picture of what was going on. So I didn't want to say anything premature, but my first impression was that there seems to be it's a very exciting moment, but it also shows certain tensions that I guess as a movement we really have to think about. There seems to be what people describe to me as this sort of massive moment of opening up. Suddenly everybody wanted to be an anarchist or act like an anarchist, or was taking up these sort of tactics and forms of organization or forms of popular assembly that had previously been associated with anarchists. And then there was a sort of a tension, almost a step backwards, because it revealed something that I've seen in a lot of places, where there's a kind of division between purists and people who want to open things up. I mean, it's not clear that everybody wants to be a mass social movement, or at least right away. So I thought it was very, very, I don't understand it enough to say much more, but it seems to me that there are certain critical tensions going on that are really important to us right now. So I'm trying to learn as much as I can, just for the sake of, if we ever get to the point of being as advanced as you are, we're going to hit the same problems. I think that Greece is at the epicenter of things, and it's quite remarkable. I mean, one thing I can say is that the IMF can be defeated. It's happened before. The IMF was almost destroyed, and it was destroyed by exactly the kind of social movements that seem to be the most healthy and flourishing here, which is ones that are not attempting to seize state power, but continue applying continual pressure against the legitimacy of the sphere of mainstream politics itself. That kind of pressure works. Reformists will always say that you can't change things structurally unless you're willing to make compromises. But in a certain way, the unwillingness and the ability to really hold the line and not make compromises actually drives the politicians to do things they would never do otherwise. And I think that kind of dynamic, I can see it here. I think that if Greece calls the bluff of this sort of new wave of structural adjustment sort of policies, it could have repercussions all over the world, and I think it probably will. Mm-hmm. I'm long past the point where I believe that things have to get worse before they can get better. I've been hearing that my entire life, and it never works. I think it was a good thing in that it created a possibility of opening up certain types of space for action that might not have existed before. I think it's a good thing too because it got a lot of people mobilized who thought that it might be possible by working through mainstream channels to the thing people don't realize is that Obama was using social movement rhetoric and social movement organizing techniques in a massive way to get elected. As soon as he did become elected, he made some gestures that he wanted to maintain that and keep up a grassroots group to maintain pressure on his left, but almost immediately he abandoned that. And the effect was just chilling on even a lot of anarchists. It's sort of drawn into campaigning, temporarily dropped their anarchist hat and thought, well, let's give mainstream politics a try. And I don't think any of those are coming back. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of people who are brought into political organizing who hadn't been anarchists, who hadn't been political at all. And are just so angry now that I think it's actually very beneficial to anti-authoritarian movements. I mean, very few people are now arguing that, well, we just need to keep on doing the same thing and eventually, we'll be able to create incremental change. People are very, very angry about what happened. But at the same time, the fact that it's not a right-wing regime allows certain forces that sort of open up a space for more direct action and political engagement without severe repression, I think, which hadn't existed before. I mean, it takes a few years before you see the difference. In the first year or so, I guess it's been 16 months now, the initial signs weren't very good. Actually, they seem to be legally more repressive than they were before. They're using conspiracy theory charges and things like that they hadn't even been doing under Bush. I think there's about a 2-year lag between change of regime and change of tactical possibilities. So it's beginning to open up.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by the left. If you mean the mainstream party-based left, they seem to have been remarkably ineffective. I mean, partly because they've become the real core of neoliberalism, even more than the right in a way. The right has been better able to profit off it because, at least they're willing to play the populist card in a way the left no longer is. There's been a tremendous collapse of the very principle of vision and hope on the part of the mainstream left. It's been abandoned. And I think that, in a way, that's what neoliberalism has been. It's been this giant militarized, securitized system, which is ultimately about the destruction of any possibility of alternative visions. I think that's the ultimate political bottom line. And that neoliberalism is much more a political phenomenon than an economic phenomenon. It's dressed up as an economic phenomenon. But economically doesn't work very well. It doesn't really promote prosperous capitalism and capitalist prosperity. What it does do is completely stifle the possibility of imagining an alternative to capitalism, even as it slowly strangles and destroys capitalism itself. So it becomes almost a nihilistic force. I think there's more economic models out there than we think. There's all sorts of interesting experiments. Again, part of the problem is that the information is stifled. There's large parts of the world where alternative economies already exist, but they exist covertly. They exist in ways that are off the books. In much of the world, the informal economy, the off-the-books economy, is much, much larger than the formal economy. It might not be a model it might not be a utopian model, but it works on very different principles. Alternative economic principles are everywhere. We just have to open up our eyes to see them. And part of the problem is that we have this statist reflex, that we always want to see an example of a country where there's one principle. But, that hasn't existed for ages anyway. So I think we need to change our lens in effect and see that forms of socialism, communism, alternative economics already exist. And experiments about using technologies to do these same sort of things people have already been doing with each other more effectively are taking place all over the world, in India and Africa and Asia. And just spreading the information is the most important thing right now because people don't know.
Same stereotypes about 100 years now.
Throwing the bombs and whatnot.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, one of the things that I've really tried to do in the course of my own political life has been just that. To change people's perceptions, not only of anarchists, because the word anarchist isn't that important to me. I use it almost as a provocation. also intellectual honesty, because there is a certain tradition. And since I am working in ideas for a living, it seems only honest to say where your ideas come from. But on a more basic level, that we need to start by changing people's perceptions of what's already there, of people's common sense. And the words we use to do that are not as important as breaking those blinkers. It's not clear to me how to do it, but I'll give an example. One of the most remarkable things that you see over and over again when you sort of talk to a crowd of ordinary people about the notion of anarchism is people immediately say, well, obviously we need to have police and a state, because if it doesn't exist, everyone would just start killing each other. Now, the interesting thing about this statement is it is empirically false. You can go to places where the police disappear. That doesn't happen. So the question, I've been there. I've been to Madagascar, a place where police vanish. They won't go off the highway anymore. People have to get by somehow. People don't actually start killing each other. Pretty much carry on like before. So the question is, why do we think that? What is it about our everyday common sense that it just seems absolutely natural that people will act, to assume that people will act in a way that, in fact, they do not act? And I think those are the kind of questions we have to ask ourselves. Why does that seem so commonsensical to people? What is it about the nature of living under power that people feel that power is necessary? Because power itself makes you behave in a way that seems to justify its existence.
The will of power isn't a bit contradictory with this point of view?
The will to power.
The will to power.
You mean the Nietzschean idea? Oh, but we have that too. Well, this is the other thing. I think that there's a great debate about human nature, and has been in anarchism for some time. And I've always found it I've never understood it. Because any statement saying man is good or man is evil, how can you make an argument like that? Because all such terms only apply to humans. The fact that we can think all these things mean that people are necessarily all of those things. These, fish aren't good or evil. This is a concept that only makes sense in terms of people. People made it up to describe themselves, and therefore each one that we can come up with must exist. I think that so there's an argument of, do we have natural drives, or are we, sort of blank slate created by culture? And they're also a big political argument. And people assume that the assumption that there are natural drives means that people are doomed to, for example, have states and police. I think that's completely backwards. I think that we have lots of drives. I think we have thousands of contradictory drives. And that's exactly what allows for the possibility of freedom, because our drives are pulling us in every different direction possible at the same time. So yes, we have the will to power, we have the will to equality, we have the will to love, we have the will to destruction. All of these things coexist constantly. They have to, otherwise how would we be able to think about them? Mm-hmm. To just become ritualized.
After
you go out, you burn a bank, you break. Everybody knows what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think that's actually very important, because the moment your tactics become predictable, you're in decline. It strikes me that a social movement has to constantly reinvent itself. But the strategy of occupations at the same time, ultimately, some kind of dual power situation has to emerge if we're ever going to get anywhere. We have to open up spaces. And if you look at Oaxaca was a great example, Chiapas is a great example. I mean, the Zapatista communities, 15 years later, they're still there. So it is possible to open spaces on a permanent basis. But, the closer you are to the centers of capital, the more difficult it becomes. For example, I'm from New York, where it's almost inconceivable to permanently occupy spaces. In New York, everything is ephemeral. You keep trying. You open a squad, you'll have it for a couple weeks. And there are a few social spaces that number of them, but they're very marginal geographically. But that's where Wall Street is. If there's any place where it would be impossible, that's it. On the other side of the world, you have places like Madagascar, where probably 80% of the country is like effectively occupied and self-organized and autonomous, and nobody cares. In between, is where most people live, and that ability to see space and hold space is incredibly fluid. But it's also, some of the more inspiring examples, or strategically, actually come from places, even in the Middle East, where some groups that I'm not in any way sympathetic to politically have come up with very ingenious methods of doing that, which I think it would be useful to study. Oaxaca are people who, they're us. I mean, they're very much the same sort of people, but like the Sadrists in Iraq are engaged in very ingenious sorts of dual power strategies, very often based on creating an institutional structure which does something that no one could possibly object to. Like they create clinics for pregnant women or something, which are illegal. And then they build up an infrastructure around that and gradually create cleared spaces and understandings of of the security forces that you stay out of here, I'll stay out of there, and gradually build a dual power situation out of that. So there's a million different ways to do that, to gradually, but it involves coming to a series of tacit accommodations with your enemies. Sort of creating a balance of forces and that will hold. And that's a very complicated and delicate thing, but it can be done. But there's mass resistance, there's subtle forms of resistance, and the interesting thing is how those subtle forms of resistance draw on the more explicit ones. And I remember someone said that Napoleon was ultimately not defeated by enemy armies, but by desertion. The largest single casualties were desertion, but also from the fact that thousands and thousands of French farm boys, started cutting off the end of their trigger fingers. Oh, it's an accident, and they weren't being able to be drafted. The sort of subtle, invisible forms of resistance. That's what really destroyed slavery. There was the movement that we all know about, the abolitionist movement, but there's also a million subtle forms of passive resistance, invisible resistance, and the spectacular ritualized stuff and the subtle stuff that you can't see play off against one another. And I think that's what ultimately destroys things like the IMF. It's that convergence of 1,000 different forms of resistance at different levels of visibility at the same time. Well, I basically divided my days. That's what I did. I was there 3 days a week, and when I was there, I was a professor. I never did anything political in the town of New Haven, Connecticut. In fact, I thought I was being very clever. Then I would go to New York and be an anarchist, so that was easy. Take the train, switch hats, I thought that was fine. It turned out it was them who was crazy, because not me, because I thought, and normally this should have worked, right? You say, I'm not going to step on your personal toes, right? Your personal power, I'm not going to, challenge it in any way. Because after all, there's the Yale hierarchy and they're obnoxious, but the IMF is much more obnoxious, and you have to choose your battles, So I chose to fight the one against where I thought I could make the most difference in the world. And using the fact that I was from Yale to sort of legitimate because, as I always say, it's not that people think that anarchist ideas are bad ideas, they think they're crazy. Sure, it would be lovely not to have police, it would be lovely to have democracy and self-organization, but that's not going to work, that's what everyone says. So the more you have someone with sort of intellectual authority saying, no, it's not crazy, that has a tremendous effect. And I knew that they knew that I was doing this. On a certain level, that I was using their name, and it's very funny in a million levels what has happened in Yale, because I come from a working class background, so it just the idea of my being in Yale was kind of absurd. Even if I did try to play along, they would never have kept me because I wasn't one of them, and they knew it, and I knew it. And so I was, playing with the authority that I had. I mean, it's not that I hadn't earned it through insane amounts of work, but it's also true that I didn't come from the right background, and I wasn't trying to act like I. If you don't come from the right background, you can, be accepted, but you have to look like you really, really want it. And I was doing the opposite. So in a way, I knew that I didn't know they were going to be quite so crazy in how they did it. And I didn't. What really surprised me was that the entire rest of the intellectual establishment in America, most of whom laugh at the anthropology department at Yale, or if indeed they know it exists, because it's so obscure. I'd often get, there's an anthropology department at Yale? I mean, they're really not very prominent people. But the institutional authority suddenly kicked in, and suddenly I couldn't get a job anywhere in America. That kind of shocked me. But what happened at Yale, I mean, it was a game. And I think that I'm still in no way regret what I did there. I don't regret going there. I don't regret doing what I did. I don't regret getting kicked out. I'm quite proud of getting kicked out. But I am rather surprised by the reaction of everyone else in America.
Mhm.
What about the student you tried to help?
She's fine. She's still there. She's
So
finishing her
they
dissertation.
didn't,
She's taking a little bit too long, but I'm trying to be patient.
no, they didn't throw her away.
No, because she was, because the union kicked in very strongly to Graeber. And at that moment, she didn't want to play the race card, but she's Korean and a Korean woman. And at that time, I think partly what saved, first she tried to talk to all the deans about how she was being unfairly persecuted, and no one would talk to her. They just ignored her. And then the next day, a story came out in the paper about how Yale has no black women at all in the faculty, and women and minorities are just not being promoted at all. And it was a slight national scandal. So she came back and the next day, and they were like, okay, immediately got a interview of everyone. So she managed to use that. I mean, she really didn't want to have to, but as it turns out, she's okay. She's writing an incredibly brilliant dissertation. That's not a bad thing. No. Actually, one of the more exciting things that's happened in the last 5 years is the revival of Students for a Democratic Society. There's been I think that in the early part of the decade, in 2000, 2001, when the height of the globalization movement, there wasn't so much going on. I mean, there was a lot going on campuses, but that wasn't the focus of mobilization. And I think in the latter part of the decade, it's really shifted to campuses, and now we have the occupations, the New School of California, and many other places. So I think that student militancy has increased dramatically, partly because the universities themselves become a kind of a field of struggle. But remember that America also has very large and important public universities. Places like Harvard and Yale play a certain very specific role in sort of reproducing an elite. And they become both a way of creating a sort of economic and cultural and political elite, but also the foils of a kind of right-wing populism. So in a way, it's almost a disciplinary system that's very much in the interests of capital, because they both sort of co-opt certain elements of the left and then get everyone else to hate them. It's a very clever game in a certain way. But on the other hand, they're not the most intellectually productive places. I mean, very few ideas. I mean, in a way, Harvard or Yale is where ideas come to die. When people who have ideas, then they get hired, then they don't do anything for the rest of their life. They just sit around. They're not some of the students are very good. They're not intellectually vibrant. Whereas someplace like Berkeley and the University of California system, which is a public system, is much more intellectually alive. I went to SUNY State University of New York, CUNY in New York City University, which used to be free until the neoliberal reforms, and is still very, very cheap. All these places, I think, are much more intellectually productive, a much more center of ideas than the sort of big corporate, old institutions. Well, it's disturbing. You mean the movement away from liberal arts and the idea of liberal arts as a sort of ideal? I think that there's a huge battle over the question of value and the role of universities. There's an idea that I think it was C.B. Macpherson once said that universities play the same role in capitalist society as the court jester played in medieval society. That, because they always said the problem for people in power is first of all, how to get people to tell them if they're doing something stupid, but B, not do it in a way that embarrasses them or seems, can be the basis of popular criticism. So in a way, court jester is perfect because they can tell you when you're doing something dumb, but they're also, a hunchback dwarf who just seems like a joke. They have a certain license. The way universities are the same thing. They're there to go through different possibilities for power and have a critique, but a critique that's framed in such a way that ordinary people think it's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. That's useful for power, and in a way that role is a little bit effaced now. I don't know. Perhaps it's a sign of a decline of a system that they don't even want to hear bad news anymore. But ultimately, what universities are, and what I always believed universities to be, is they're a kind of space of experiment with non-economic value. They're one of the few places in a capitalist society where people are supposed to not be thinking about the economic bottom line, but basically all other values other than the economic, and to experiment with them, to think about how they relate. And the assault on liberal arts and on education is an assault on that principle in a certain way. Again, it's what I say about neoliberalism becomes a form of nihilism. They're so desperate to efface anything that might provide an alternative to their one monolithic perspective that they're strangling themselves. They really need sources of other sources of value. In destroying it, they're ultimately destroying themselves. But unfortunately, they're destroying themselves in a way which allows people no imagination of alternatives. It's really interesting, isn't it? We really need to look at the whole idea of conspiracy theories historically. It's a fascinating thing. Because on the one hand, yes, you have that idea of there are these networks of insidious individuals who are sort of planning things. And that's been around, I guess, at least since the time of the French Revolution, who was really behind the French Revolution, that kind of the Illuminati. On the other hand, then in America we have the opposite effect, which is the invocation of the notion of the conspiracy theory for almost any oppositional thought which implies that the ruling class has any agency. And I find that disturbing too, because if you look at it historically, as far as I can make out, the rhetoric of conspiracy theory, which says that, if you believe that the CIA has ever been involved in drug smuggling, for example, you are as crazy as someone who believes that the Pope is a space alien. These are equivalent, one of which is obviously true, how could they not have been involved in some time or another? The other of which is clearly lunatic, corresponds with when most things the government did became secret, with the creation of the national security state in the 1950s. So suddenly, not only is which completely violated the American tradition of democratic openness, at least, even through the 20s and 30s, it was just assumed that people had a right to know what their government was doing, even in terms of military affairs and so forth. So the moment where suddenly everything the government does is classified, to even speculate about what it might be turns you into a lunatic. That's a different question than you were asking, though. The ontology, yes, I think that it's fascinating the way that when you have, when you argue with people on the right, I find, they're constantly trying to bring things back to individuals and networks of individuals. And it's a way of avoiding the idea of structural forces, obviously. But yeah, there seems to be something more there. I always found it very interesting, too, that people like Joe McCarthy or J. Edgar Hoover, Roy Cohn. I mean, some of the most famous right-wing conspiracy theorists or thinkers were also like, their sexuality also was a secret as well. There are people who it must have seemed almost inevitable that people were sneaking around in secret places doing things they don't want anybody to know about. So I wonder if there's a certain degree of simple repression behind this whole thing. But it's something that, you need a very talented ethnographer to explore, because it's the very thing that would be hardest to investigate. Sort of levels on levels of paranoia and sort of networks of double dealing, and it just always disturbs me when, one of the things that disturbs me about the idea of security culture in America is that once one introduces that element of paranoia, one necessarily starts thinking more and more like a right winger without even realizing it. That's the great tension. I mean, that's what they want to do to you. They want you to turn you into one of them. God, yes. It's very personally distressing for me, because I'm a little like people like Noam Chomsky and Herman Finkelstein. I mean, I come from that same background. So I'm a certain tradition of Jewish radicalism, a sort of Martin Buber tradition. My mother was in Mount Hatzair, which was the sort of, they were the socialist Zionist group that believed that, sort of we need to go to build socialism together with the Arabs, that sort of thing. And, so obviously we're very upset. That's the whole subject of what goes on in Israel is deeply personally painful, because how could things go more utterly, completely, terribly wrong? I think it's remarkable. I mean, I have such admiration for the activists who do that sort of work, because you're up against the most, maybe, Tibetans facing the Chinese army face something comparable in terms of complete lack of accountability. But to engage in that kind of nonviolent resistance against people who apparently will stop at nothing. I mean, there are almost no bounds to what the IDF will do, particularly under the current regime. And the ability to translate, the propaganda engine is just so powerful. I don't know how it's possible to break it, but it has to be done. I mean, and it's possible that this will start to happen now, just because the only way, this is Pisces piracy. It's illegal on every possible level. It's an illegal blockade, attacked in international waters. In a way, it's calling the bluff of almost the entire pretense of international law. When people were saying, just imagine what would happen if Iran had done something like this. They'd be nuking them by now. I mean, perhaps they're just so insane at this point that the facade, the propaganda facade, will begin to crumble. One can only hope. I mean, just when I think about, what it would be like to live in Gaza, my heart breaks. It's hard to think about it. It's so horrible, the hopelessness of that situation. It never seems to end. The IMF can be defeated. It's happened before. So what do you think is going to happen in Greece? Do you think I think you're going to beat the IMF. I'm optimistic. What do you think? The IMF can be defeated. It's happened before.